We're now going in our next session on AI, borders, and migration. So this will be an armchair conversation between Professor Jamie Liu, which is one of my amazing colleagues at the University of Ottawa Faculty of Law. So she's a professor in the common law section, and research and teaching focus on immigration, refugee, and citizenship law. And she will be in conversation with my friend Petra Molnar, who is a lawyer and anthropologist specializing in migration and human rights. She leads many projects looking on the field of the use of AI and surveillance technologies at the border and in areas of crisis around the world. And I will hand it over to you two for, I'm sure, will be a passionate conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Florian. It's an honor to be here today with a distinguished group of guests, and I'm extremely excited to be in conversation with Petra, who is not only a brilliant colleague, but a great friend. So it will feel like having a normal coffee visit, I would say, and talking about the many things that we're both interested in, but more importantly, learning from you and your research and the things that you have been able to think about more deeply than many of us. So we're going to do this in a conversation style and then open it up to the audience later on. If you have any questions, we will give you an opportunity to do that at a later stage. But the one thing I wanted you to do, and given the positionality that we may be in, is maybe to situate the context. What is the context within which we're talking about? We're talking about migration, we're talking about borders. Could you give us the current state of play when we're talking about border and technology?
Thank you so much, Jamie, and thanks to all of you for sticking around. I know it's Friday afternoon, so we'll try and make this as lively and interesting as possible. And it is a bit of a heavy topic, so I also do want to recognize that. I also have some photos that I tend to share as I speak about this work to situate some of the remarks on the ground as much as possible to really kind of bring it back to the lives of real people. But I just want to, thank you for being here, and big thanks to Florian and the whole organizing committee for having us. I think migration is an area that up until fairly recently has not been talked about enough in the kind of intersection between technology and technological critiques, and it's really great to have this space to be able to share some insights with you. So I am indeed a lawyer and an anthropologist, and I've been really privileged because the focus of my work for the past 6 years has been the kind of interplay between the human impact of surveillance technology on people crossing borders. And so I've spent the last 6 years or so now trying to track and document how these new high-risk technologies are playing out on people's lives. So things like surveillance, automated decision-making, and different experimental projects as well that are being rolled out at the border and in migration. And just to situate it, I do want to share some reflections with you from my work, and it's really spanned multiple borders. We were, for example, at the US-Mexico border, looking at the interplay of technology there, also the fringes of Europe and Greece and Turkey, and seeing how these new technological experiments play out, the Kenya-Somalia border, and most recently, the occupied Palestinian territories in the West Bank. And what I've seen time and again is that borders, in particular, are spaces of basically like a laboratory, a high-risk laboratory of technological experiments, because the context here is really important. And to those of you who are interested in migration or who've had your own migration experience, it will not come as a surprise when we try and unpick what's happening, because there is already so much discretion and huge power differentials that are present in spaces like borders and refugee camps. And so now imagine what happens when your journey is at every point augmented by risky and unregulated technology that's used to control movement and migration. So really, from looking at, for example, the Sonora Desert at the US-Mexico border, to the Kenya-Somali border, to various refugee camps in the EU, these projects are not something that are theoretical. We're talking about drone surveillance, sound cannons that emit piercing shrieks to prevent people from getting close to the border, thermal cameras, also automated weapons that are increasingly making their way into border spaces of occupation, and also more experimental projects that we'll get into, things like lie detectors, and even some other ones that I want to show you. But again, all of this is doing is creating this kind of unregulated panopticon of technological experimentation. And what I want to do with you today is tease out why that's happening and why so little regulation actually exists.
Yeah, Petra, that's so interesting. You've raised a lot of very interesting threads already, but I guess, you aptly said earlier that this is really about people, right? And the human aspect of things, that we're talking about human interactions at particular sites. And I wondered if you could talk about the human rights that are implicated in the use of technology at these sites and the impact it may have, not only at the instance at the border, but longer term, and what that may mean for the rest of us in society as we think through these issues.
Sure, and this is perhaps where a little bit of my own positionality comes into play as well, because I'm not a technologist by training. I am a refugee lawyer and a social anthropologist, and I kind of fell into trying to understand how AI, automation, and technology is playing into this. And so the broader context of migration and refugee issues is super important to think about, because we are already talking about a violent regime where borders have been sites of violence for decades, centuries, really, right? And what we're seeing is that already violent global policies are sharpened through the use of technology that's developed specifically for the purposes of border control and exclusion. And these technologies have real impact. They separate families. They push people into life-threatening terrain. And of course, as we were saying, right, like exacerbate the kind of historical and systemic discrimination that is inherent in the migratory space already. And for me, what I keep seeing again and again across these different contexts is that borders are a testing ground. They're a testing ground for new technology because they're places where regulation is deliberately limited, right? And there's this kind of anything goes frontier attitude that informs the development and deployment of tech. And so for me, when I'm trying to understand these impacts, it's always important to consider the broader ecosystem, an ecosystem that's replete with criminalization of movement, anti-migrant sentiments, and violent practices like pushbacks, and different ways that people have already died at the border. But I want to bring it back to a particular context because it's very easy to kind of get lost in the theory, and I think it's important to talk about individual stories and families. So my team and I were at the US-Mexico corridor just last year, and it's of course an area where thousands of people cross very regularly. And it's also an area where new technology is making way into that border space, such as this integrated fixed tower, which is an Israeli piece of technology that has been sold to the United States government to essentially create a surveillance dragnet across the Sonora. But what's interesting is, been probably one of the more surreal moments of my career, and I've had many, let me tell you, that's a different talk. When we were literally on the sands of the Sonora, the Department of Homeland Security announced that these fixed AI towers are not enough, thermal cameras are not enough. What we need are robodogs, four-legged military-grade technology that has now been rolled out at the US-Mexico border. But again, the future is not just more technology, it may be more death. Thousands of people have already died making this dangerous crossing, like Mr. Alvarado, who was a young husband and father. He was from Central America, and we visited his memorial site after hours of trekking into the Sonora Desert with a search and rescue group. He came to the United States in search of a better life to support his family, and unfortunately succumbed mere kilometers away from a major highway. And what's difficult is governments often say that we need more technology to expand the border. Let's do a smart border. Let's somehow use these new projects to make the border less violent and deter people from coming. But what is happening is this does not deter people from making dangerous crossings. Instead, what happens is people are forced to change their routes towards less inhabited terrain, leading to increased loss of life. I would urge you to look at the work of, for example, anthropologist Jason DeLeon and others in Arizona like Jeffrey Boyce and Samuel Chambers, who've been documenting the rise of deaths as the smart border infrastructure has arisen there. So in the not so distant future, people like Mr. Alvarado might actually be chased by these quadruped robo-dog military-grade technology. It's very, very disturbing.
Yeah, it is very disturbing and alarming to see the different kinds of technology that are being deployed. But I wondered if we could maybe step back up and talk about why is this happening, given, is this naturally an extension of what we've always been doing at borders? You allude to this idea of experimentation, and I think that needs to be talked about a little bit more, that this is a site that's not regulated, and as lawyers, we're always interested about how and why these kinds of things are being permitted. Is there oversight? Could you speak a little bit more about that?
Sure. And just as an aside, I always like to put this picture up because I think it does get at some of these things that we're concerned about. This is, of course, the infamous Trump wall. You can drive up to it, you can touch it, the rust will stain your hand for the rest of the day as a reminder of this kind of hulking piece of violent infrastructure. But it also just ends, and you can climb this hill and kind of pop your head over to the other side. If that's not a manifestation of the artificiality of borders, I don't know what is. But as Jamie alluded to in her question, if I kind of have to sum up this corpus of work, it would be precisely this point. There is very little regulation, and it's deliberate, because it allows for these spaces that are already violent and deadly to continue being so, and to be this kind of laboratory of experimentation for new technology that perhaps wouldn't be allowed in other spaces. And if I may, I'd want to share one more vignette from the ground. Because again, I think it's hard to imagine what these spaces actually are like and what they're doing to people. And I want to say that this next picture is a bit difficult to look at. I should also say, you've noticed I don't really show faces or these mass photos of nameless crowds of refugees. That's very deliberate, because my team and I are trying to get away from these very problematic depictions that sometimes people call poverty porn, of dehumanizing the people that we work with in images as well. So I tend to take pictures of infrastructure and border guards, although not in this presentation. They don't like that very much. But we, of course, also directly work with individuals and communities, and I will get to that so that we don't end on a depressing note, as I normally do. But this next photo, I think, is an important one. In addition to the work in the occupied Palestinian territories and the East Africa context and the US-Mexico border, I've also spent quite a bit of time in Greece looking at how people have been interacting with this kind of violent infrastructure of tech. And almost as a pilgrimage, when I'm in the land border between Turkey and Greece, I make this drive down to Sidero, which is a really small village. And it's very beautiful. You can't really see it, but it's kind of flanked by these golden poplar trees. And outside that village lies a cemetery. It's this resting place of people who've died making the journey to Europe. And it is painstakingly kind of taken care of by the local imam. And most of the graves are unmarked because, of course, bodies are found and sometimes people don't know who they belong to. But there are a few inscriptions. And last time I was there, I touched the fresh grave of a young woman who was from Syria and died on the 2nd of February, 2021. She was born in 1993, and there were still yellow roses on her grave. But while I was paying my respects, something caught my eye. These 3 holes that were kind of chewed out from the ground and filled with this kind of putrid green water. 3 open graves waiting. So this is the region where experimental new surveillance technology is being deployed. We're talking about things like aerostat machines and drone surveillance, loud sound cannons, different algorithmic decision-making that is playing into how people's movements are tracked, for example, in refugee camps when they're being warehoused there. And why is this allowed? Because borders are these spaces of discretion. They are spaces that are difficult to get to. This is a military area, for example. And even someone who's doing human rights monitoring or who's a journalist has an extremely difficult time to get into these spaces, even just for documentation purposes. Not to mention, a lot of this tech is hard to see, right? You notice that, of course, it's hard to take a picture of a visa algorithm or even like drone surveillance or thermal camera. Sometimes, like with the towers that we were seeing, you can drive up there and see it, but a lot of this infrastructure is hidden, and that is very purposeful because it allows for it to happen in this kind of unaccountable, untransparent way that makes it very difficult to monitor. And that is no accident.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you paint a very bleak dystopian reality that we live in, that we don't really fully grasp what the reality is. And your research is really important in creating awareness about this and amplifying the ways in which the border is constantly evolving and the ways in which technology is playing such a big role in this. And I wondered, you know, despite the bleak picture that you paint for us today, do you have hope, and what can we do about it? What are our next steps in terms of how we discuss this, how we you know, show resistance against the use of these technologies, especially when we're interested in humanizing our experiences at the border?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think one of the things is looking at people's experiences and trying to capture how they actually feel. Like this young mother who was basically facing a forcible transfer into one of these really high-tech refugee camps. And she typed out this message that says, if we go there, we will go crazy. I mean, I think testimonies are very important because they bring it back to the ground and they humanize what we are really concerned about. Because this is what the spaces look like. We're talking about difficult infrastructure that's augmented by increasing kind of surveillance dragnets and technology. So part of the project, I think, must be witnessing and documenting and collecting testimonies and evidence and getting a sense of what is actually happening on the ground. You know, because we're talking about these really big concerns. But for me, it's also about these broader questions, right? We're not only just talking about profound impacts on people's human rights and lives and civil liberties, and from a, you know, if I put my lawyer hat on, like, how do you challenge an algorithmic decision that, for example, I don't know, 7,000 students in the UK were wrongfully deported as a result of a faulty algorithm that accused them of cheating on a language acquisition test? If you're one of those students, how do you challenge this? Like, who's actually responsible, right? Is it the coder of the algorithm? Is it the immigration officer who uses it? Is it the algorithm itself? Should we be suing algorithms in a court of law? I mean, these are questions that we have to start grappling with, right? Especially in these very discretionary, difficult spaces of vast power differentials like the border and migration. And the other thing I really want to, I want to broaden the discussion too, because it's about these broader questions, right? It's like, who gets to decide what counts as a possible future? Who determines what we innovate on and why? Like, why are we developing AI lie detectors to test out on refugees, like the iBorder Control Project, Avatar, and others, for those of you who want to look it up, when we could be using AI to root out racist border guards? Like, that's a priority and a choice that a powerful set of actors in that space is making, right? And it is this kind of like, we have to look broadly at this. We have to look at this kind of vast power differential between the so-called global north and places where people are actually moving from, right? And this kind of big tech capture of a lot of this space. Because if private sector actors can dictate that robo-dogs and AI lie detectors are the so-called solution to the unwanted others from coming, that's a huge issue, right? I've gone to some of these conferences like the World Border Security Congress or DFEA, which are basically like, you know, a playground for the development of various problematic technology. And it's incredible that the starting point isn't, you know, fair decision-making or improving access to services and psychosocial support for people. It's robo-dogs, it's drones, it's armored tanks. I mean, again, it's very clear whose priorities matter here. So what do we do, right? Like, how do we not get depressed about this? I mean, I've definitely gone through phases where it feels very, very bleak. But I think part of it is, yeah, it's just being aware of these power dynamics and how technology is exacerbating that, because none of this is neutral, right? But if I may, I would like to, for once, actually end on a positive note. Oh, wait, sorry, before I get to the positive note, there's one more negative note. Because one thing too, I think, as hopefully you're getting, I think contextual specificity is super important because it allows us to look and zero in and see, this is what's happening at the border. This is what's happening in refugee camps. But the thing is, these projects bleed over from spaces like that. And recently, just in the spring, the New York City Police Department announced very proudly that they are now going to, once again, they already had them, roll out a fleet of robo-dogs to help keep New York safe. And this one even has little spots like a Dalmatian. So it's not just at the border anymore. So what do we do about this? Normally I end there, and I think that's very depressing. So I would like to end on a slightly better note. I think, speaking truth to power is very important. Being aware of where power localizes in society and whose decisions get precedence and resources and space in the media is very, very important. And academia also plays a very important role in legitimizing high-risk experimental technology. So I think we also need to call ourselves out here. But for us and my small team, one of the ways that we try and work is from a very grounded community-based perspective. And we run this project called the Migration and Technology Monitor, which is an archive and a platform and a community in Arabic, French, Spanish, and English. And it's really meant for people on the move themselves to be able to come together, learn about border surveillance, and also do their own work. And this year, was our inaugural fellowship program for 5 people on the move in situations of active displacement to tell their own stories and do their own work on border surveillance. So we once again kind of get away from this very patronizing, like, I'm the expert and I know what's best. Rather, let's fund people on the ground and give them the space and time to develop projects on their own. And so we are working with these 5 wonderful humans. I've learned so much from them, and we learn together. And we have different projects that we're incubating, for example, looking at original reporting around the CBP1 app at the US-Mexico border that Veronica Martinez is looking at. We have Neri, who is doing work using different communication technologies like WhatsApp to improve access to services of Venezuelan refugees. Simon, for example, is developing a very cool psychosocial app for refugees. And Rajendra, a very interesting project looking at surveillance of migrant workers in the Middle East region. And he's a former migrant worker himself. So, okay, this is 5 people, 5 small projects, but for me, it gives me a lot of hope and a lot of kind of joyful resistance as well, being able to say, okay, we're funding these projects and really giving people runway and leeway to do their own work and to be the experts in this space, right? I mean, here I am again taking oxygen and space from my colleagues who should and could be here. So I think it's really important to open up these spaces of conversation too, to make sure that really people with lived experience of migration are the experts when it comes to the sharpest edges of technological development. So I think I will leave it there.
Thank you, Petra. I have to say your presentation is a little bit just, borrow a cliche, a canary in the coal mine, really alerting us to some of the more significant and troubling things that are happening in our society today and at places where it affects the most marginalized people, I would say. So I want to thank you for sharing your research and would like to invite people to ask you any questions about it.
Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. One thing that stood out to me was the fact that borders tend to be places where governments tend to experiment a lot. So places where they'll experiment with the technology, that was one thing that stood out to me. And I think that a lot of it is due to the fact that it's an area where it can't be regulated between the 2 countries. And I was wondering, I think that international agreements would be one way in which they could go forward. I was wondering if you've done any outreach with any international organizations and trying to figure out some sort of agreements to have certain things banned.
Thank you for that question, and I think it goes to show just how much of a reluctant lawyer I am that I completely forgot to talk about this area. So definitely, I mean, governance in this space is bleak at best. Like, we really need to think about how we can put forward certain regulatory frameworks, both at the local level, national level, and international level. And definitely, there's been a coalition of us, for example, involved in the European Union's AI Act, trying to get it to go further on border technology. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given the political climate around migration, it didn't go as far as we hoped, but it wasn't a total loss. I mean, I think, again, these kind of omnibus pieces of governance making are difficult anyways, but at least there's a little bit of pushback around some of the kind of normalization of border tech. But for example, we were really hoping to draw a red line under things like predictive analytics that are used for border interdiction, and individualized risk assessments that were basically based on algorithmic decision making. So we could have definitely gone further. At the international level, I mean, okay, yeah, technically, I guess I'm an international human rights lawyer, but a reluctant one. So I think normatively it can be quite powerful, but I don't know, do we need another treaty on like border tech? I mean, people are gonna sign it and ratify it, and then what? Like, I will say though, my colleague Lorna McGregor at Essex University and I just worked with the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner on a report on border technologies. And to be honest, it went a little further than I thought. Like, they actually did put to paper that they wanted to sign on to a moratorium and a ban of certain border technologies, and I can send it around. It is powerful when the OACHR puts out something like this. What it will do down the line, I'm not sure, but I think at least normatively, there is a little bit of conversation now happening. But then when you look at places like, I don't know, Canada, the United States, of course, other regions around the world, it's difficult. It's difficult to get states on board to govern, precisely because why would they, right? Like, what's the incentive to govern border technologies when you can experiment with stuff that you wouldn't be allowed to experiment with in other spaces? So we really are facing an uphill battle. And the last thing I will say is also, again, like bringing it back to the private sector. If you know that you're part of this extremely lucrative border industrial complex that people have called it, why would the private sector want to regulate as well, right? They want to be able to say, no, we need to experiment, we need to innovate when it comes to robodogs and AI lie detectors and things, because it's big money. So it's very, very difficult to come up with some sort of solution from the governance and regulatory perspective, but we're trying.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation, very enlightening. I have a question. So you gave us examples from borders that happen to have conflicts around them. My question is more toward, so I'm going to give a little anecdote. In 2012 and 2013, I went to Nepal and I think Kenya just to do some trekking and a safari or things like that. You know, no conflict whatsoever. And at the airport, I was so surprised that, and I don't know which is which, but one of them took a photo of the iris of my eye, and the other one, so they used very advanced technologies, which frankly blew my mind in terms of privacy. And the question was, you know, you want to kind of do trekking? And again, those places have no conflict whatsoever. People go there because they're happy. So I was just wondering if you've looked into the use of technology in situations like that.
Sure, and thank you for that question. That's actually where my work started on this in Canada, looking at Canada's use of automated decision-making and different types of tools. Back in 2018 with the Citizen Lab and the University of Toronto, we did a report called Bots at the Gate. And that was my kind of first foray into looking at some of this tech. And absolutely, it was more looking at applications, for example, for visa triaging. And since then, there's been a corpus of work that is now looking at facial recognition at US-Canada borders, for example. And so absolutely, I mean, those are almost the kind of like less sexy examples, right? They're not as visceral, they don't grab you as much as some of the stuff I'm showing, but they're just as important because they underscore that essentially every single point of your journey, crossing different borders, going to airports, is now impacted by tech. And so I just flew in from New York yesterday, and on my flight, there was a facial recognition kind of check-in thing like at the gate, right? And you can opt out if you want to, but a lot of people don't know that, right? They think, okay, this is now so normalized that we must participate in this. Not to mention, of course, biometric collection at borders and iris scanning and things like that. And so part of it is like, oh, yay, great, this is so much more efficient, like, let's just get on this plane and go. But the concern is, right, we are normalizing these technological incursions without even thinking about what this is doing. And just to bring it back to the Canadian example again, with the visa triaging and these kind of different tools, and perhaps there are some of you in the room who work on this, a lot of it also is about not only consent and privacy issues, but also just transparency. Like, a lot of people don't know that this is happening. Sometimes you might be denied a visa and you don't know why, whether it was an algorithmic decision or not. So how can you actually, operate in this system? How can you challenge things? How can you opt out if it's been so obfuscated when it comes to these kind of difficult power relations that are so inherent in the migration and border space? Even if it's not a violent and conflict-ridden area, it's uncomfortable, right? When you're like dealing with border guards or you get taken for secondary screening or anything. Like, you feel the power of the state on you, right? Not to mention power that's like disaggregated somewhere out there, and you might get a visa rejection and you don't even know why. So for sure, I thank you for that question, because I think it reminds us that this is much broader than some of the kind of technical infrastructure that we are capturing in spaces like this.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. Thanks for pulling back the curtain on some of the negative applications and implications of this kind of technology at borders. I'm curious about the potential positive applications when we think about flows of people, migration patterns to borders. I work in the public health space, so thinking about vectors for infectious disease and things like that. So thinking through the applications of these kinds of technologies, what has been your experience, and maybe what are the sort of causes for concern or warning tags we should put to that kind of consideration for applications in that space?
Sure, and here I will plug the other half of the Refugee Law Lab. So I'm the kind of critical side that pokes holes in things and says, this is a problem, this is a problem. My colleague Sean Rehag, who's the other half of the Refugee Law Lab, he does more of the work on kind of this area, like trying to understand, okay, a lot of this technology is very problematic, but can we co-opt it, can we change it, can we find different ways of using tech also to rebalance some of these vast power differentials? And so I would urge you to look, at some of his work. He's doing really innovative stuff. For example, making, positive judicial decisions available to refugee lawyers through all sorts of algorithmic decision making that just wouldn't otherwise be available to, the refugee bar that's already extremely under-resourced. Often, you're dealing with government lawyers who have way more resources available to you than if you're a sole practitioner representing someone. There's all sorts of other interesting, very positive projects. I think that, it's not all bad. I mean, if you also look at the work of some of our fellows, I would say it was interesting because when we first launched the fellowship, we were kind of expecting that like everyone would be working on the sharpest edges, like negative manifestations of tech. But I would say, 3 out of the 5 projects are actually looking at technology through the lens of, okay, like how can we actually use different ways of communicating, different ways of talking about very complex problems, and increasing, for example, access to resources through different ways of communicating. Some people are even trying to, retrofit different algorithms when it comes to, for example, like other applications, like in welfare or child welfare and things like that. So I think definitely it's not all negative, but I think we always have to be careful a little bit too around this area of kind of techno-solutionism, that like tech for good, AI for good, like let's just bring blockchain into refugee camps and things like that. And like it's this idea that like, okay, well, we're going to use these like new projects to solve intractable social problems. So I would also, I tend to urge a little bit of caution that sometimes more technology and more data isn't always better when we, for example, don't have access to counsel or psychosocial support or even food in refugee camps. And yet we have all these techie things. Some people call it like the appification of refugee spaces, and it definitely is something that we're seeing, yeah.
Well, we're seeing continuing legal education informing refugee lawyers of the technology that's being used as we learn about them. Sometimes we learn about them through ATIP requests. We're like, wait a second, it looks like this decision was made by some sort of technology. And people aren't necessarily privy, as you said, to that. So it's becoming an essential part of continuing legal education to understand the technology that's being used in these spaces,
Yeah, that's a really good point.
I apologize in advance because the question was very positive and this one is kind of more of a bummer. So what struck me was kind of what you said about the artificiality of borders and then kind of like the middle space that like happens before you kind of get to that border point, and like that those are places in which you kind of don't, you're not really a human. Like they can exercise on violence on you until you reach the point where a decision maker could like look at your passport, and your safety is dependent on, not only what who issued the document, but also like the content of the document. I'm thinking of like if your gender marker doesn't match your presentation, for example, even within borders that would be considered quote unquote safe, right? So I guess given that and given your experiences, like do you see a future in which we could have like this conception of an ethical border? Like is the idea of a border itself kind of part of the issue? Just a easy question for you.
Great question to end on. Yeah, and I think it's a very important one because, again, it reminds us that we're not just talking about these specific projects or specific borders, but we really are talking about the infrastructure and the kind of underlying power dynamics of exclusion and of violence and of occupation and of these issues that go beyond AI, go beyond algorithms. Can borders in our current world with this level of power differential ever be ethical? I don't know. I mean, on some level, I am a pro-open borders person, but I'm also perhaps a pragmatist when it comes to like putting my lawyer hat on and saying, okay, we can dream of a different world and we can lean into the kind of joyful resistance of imagining something very different, while also recognizing that we can enact change today and tomorrow and in a week and a month and in a year. And those to me are not mutually exclusive. And sometimes I get in trouble with like both sides where it's like, well, you're being co-opted towards the more like reformist side of things, or you're not pushing far enough. But I think we can do both. We can push for a different world while also think about ways to make the current reality more fair and just. But at the end of the day, I mean, your question is spot on. It's these underlying structures of power and privilege and exclusion that need to be challenged, and at every level. And I think these are some cross-cutting themes of this conference as well. Like we have all these amazing panels on specific topics, but ultimately it is about like how do we create and co-create a different world. So I think it's perhaps also a call to action to think beyond just some of these kind of manifestations and think more broadly about what we could or should be doing.
With that, I think we will close this panel as we are out of time, but I just want to thank you for your thoughtful questions and especially thank Petra for sharing her very interesting research with us today.
And thank you to Jamie for taking time to be with us.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much, Jamie and Petra, for this amazing conversation. And I would just like add a plug, because Petra did not, that she has an amazing book coming up with the new press in May 2024, The Wall Have Eyes. So I highly recommend the book.